They said I was just a retired woman living off family support, and for a moment, I almost let them believe it. The ballroom lights were soft, golden, the kind that made everything look warmer than it really was, and I stood near the back of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched, watching my sister Rachel laugh like she hadn't spent the last 5 years slowly erasing me from her life. At 70, you learn to read a room quickly. You notice who looks at you and who looks past you. That night, almost everyone looked past me. The engagement party was held at a country club just outside of Boston, one of those places with polished wood floors and waitstaff who moved like shadows, quiet and efficient. I had driven 40 minutes to get there, wearing a navy dress I hadn't worn since my husband's retirement dinner, something elegant but understated, something that said I still respected the occasion, even if no one there respected me. When I arrived, the hostess smiled politely, asked for my name, and then hesitated just a second too long before handing me a small card. It didn't say Evelyn Harper. It said guest. Just that. Guest. No last name. No connection. Just a placeholder. I looked at it for a second longer than necessary, then pinned it to my dress anyway. No one noticed. Or maybe they did, and that was the point. I stepped into the room, scanning faces I used to know well. Rachel stood near the center, her arm wrapped around Daniel, her fiancé, both of them glowing under the attention. He was telling a story, something about long nights, risk, building something from nothing, and people around them nodded like they were listening to a hero. I listened too. I had always been a good listener. We built this company from the ground up, Daniel said, lifting his glass slightly, and a small ripple of applause followed. Built. From the ground up. I took a slow breath and let the words settle without reacting. Across the room, a woman in a pale dress leaned toward another guest and whispered something while glancing in my direction. I didn't hear the exact words, but I recognized the tone. I'd heard it before. Polite curiosity mixed with quiet judgment. Who is she? Oh, just family. Just family. I moved toward the refreshment table, more out of habit than hunger, and picked up a napkin I didn't need. My hands were steady. They always were. That was something my husband used to admire about me. You never give people the satisfaction of seeing you shaken, he once said. He'd been right. I didn't intend to start now. Rachel eventually noticed me. Or maybe someone pointed me out. She walked over with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Evelyn, she said, like she was trying on my name to see if it still fit. You made it. I nodded once. Of course. It's your engagement. She glanced briefly at my name tag, then back at my face. I hope everything's okay. We kept things simple tonight. Simple. That was one way to describe it. I followed her gaze as she gestured subtly around the room. Nothing about this was simple. The floral arrangements alone probably cost more than my first car. But I didn't correct her. I just smiled. It's beautiful, I said. And it was. That was the truth. Beauty and intention don't always come from the same place. Daniel joined us a moment later, placing a hand lightly on Rachel's back like he was already used to standing beside her as the center of attention. Evelyn, he said, nodding politely. Good to see you. His tone was measured. Professional. Like he was greeting someone he'd met once at a conference and couldn't quite place. I returned the nod. Congratulations, I said. Thank you, he replied, then added. It's been a long road getting here. I held his gaze for just a second longer than usual. I'm sure it has, I said quietly. There was a pause. Brief. Almost unnoticeable. Then someone called Daniel's name, and he turned away without another word. Rachel lingered for a moment, like she wanted to say something else, then thought better of it. Enjoy the evening, she said before walking back into the crowd. I watched her go, the way she blended effortlessly into a life that used to include me. The music shifted to something softer, and a man near the stage tapped his glass to get everyone's attention. If we could all gather, he called out, smiling broadly. Daniel has a few words to share. People began to move, forming a loose semicircle around the couple. I stayed where I was, just at the edge, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be overlooked. Daniel cleared his throat, lifted his glass, and began. Tonight isn't just about celebrating an engagement, he said. It's about celebrating everything it took to get here. The late nights, the risks, the people who believed in me from the beginning. He paused, scanning the room, and for a second, his eyes passed right over me without stopping. I didn't do this alone, he continued. But I'm proud to say that what we've built is ours. Every bit of it. Another round of applause. Louder this time. I felt the edges of my smile tighten just slightly, but I didn't let it fade. Not yet. Not here. I adjusted the small clutch in my hand, feeling the weight of the documents inside. Crisp paper folded neatly, signatures inked in a way that didn't leave room for interpretation. I had brought them with me without really planning to use them. At least, that's what I told myself on the drive over. But as I stood there, listening to a version of history that had no place for me, I realized something simple. Silence only protects the people who rewrite the story. And that night, they had written me out completely. I took a slow breath, the kind you take before stepping into cold water, and let my eyes move across the room one more time, memorizing the faces, the expressions, the quiet certainty they all shared. They believed what they were hearing. They believed I was just a guest, just family, just a retired woman standing at the edge of someone else's success. I smoothed the front of my dress, straightened my shoulders, and for the first time that evening, I stopped blending into the background. I didn't move yet. Not a step. But something shifted. Subtle. Internal. The kind of shift no one else notices until it's already too late. I looked at Daniel again as he finished his speech, as the room filled with applause and laughter and the clinking of glasses, and I thought, very clearly, very calmly, they really should have checked who was in the room before they decided to tell that story. I did not clap when everyone else did. I kept my hands wrapped around the glass I still had not touched, feeling the cool condensation against my fingers as the applause filled the room like something rehearsed, something automatic. It reminded me of boardrooms I had sat in years ago, when people applauded not because they believed, but because they thought they were supposed to. Daniel lowered his glass with a satisfied smile, the kind of smile that comes from thinking the story has been told exactly the way it should be. Rachel leaned into him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and for a brief moment, I saw the version of her I used to know, the younger sister who used to call me for advice, who used to ask me if she was making the right decisions. That version of her had disappeared slowly, not all at once, but in small, careful steps that were easy to ignore until there was nothing left. The music started again, soft piano notes drifting through the room, and people began to break apart into smaller groups. Conversations resumed, laughter returned, and the moment that had just been framed as something meaningful dissolved into background noise. I stayed where I was for another few seconds, letting the shift happen around me. Then I set my glass down on the nearest table without taking a sip. I did not need it. I moved slowly, deliberately, not toward the center of the room, but along the edges, where people felt safer saying what they really thought. That is where the truth usually lives. Two men stood near the bar, their voices low but not low enough. I heard they are planning to expand to the West Coast next year, one of them said, adjusting his jacket. If they can secure the funding, the other replied. I mean, it is impressive, but scaling that fast is risky. The first man shrugged. They have good leadership. Daniel seems sharp. I paused just long enough to hear that word again. Leadership. It was interesting how easily people assigned that label when they were only seeing the surface. I kept walking. Near the windows, a group of younger employees, or at least that is what they looked like, were gathered with drinks in hand, speaking with the kind of confidence that comes from being just close enough to power to feel important. Honestly, I have never even seen the original investors, one woman said, laughing lightly. It is like they do not exist. Another voice chimed in. That is because the company is basically Daniel now. He cleaned everything up when he took over. Cleaned everything up. I felt that phrase settle in my chest. Not heavy, not painful, just clear. Like a sentence you read twice, because you want to make sure you understood it correctly. I had heard versions of it before. In meetings I was no longer invited to. In emails that stopped including me. In updates that became summaries instead of conversations. I did not interrupt them. I did not need to. Their version of the story was consistent. It was also incomplete. I turned slightly, catching my reflection in the tall glass window. The navy dress. The small name tag that still read guest. The silver in my hair that I had stopped trying to hide years ago. I looked exactly like what they thought I was. That was the advantage. Underestimation is a quiet kind of leverage. It builds without anyone noticing until it is too late to adjust. Evelyn. I turned at the sound of my name. This time, it was not Rachel. It was a man I recognized after a second, though it took a moment to place him. Thomas Green. He had been with the company in its early years, back when the office was smaller, when everyone knew exactly who had signed the checks that kept things moving. He looked older now, a little more careful in the way he held himself. "I was not sure you would come," he said. "I almost did not," I replied. He gave a small nod, like he understood more than he was saying. His eyes flicked briefly to my name tag, then back to my face. "They have changed things," he said quietly. "I can see that," I answered. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just honest. "You should know," he continued, lowering his voice slightly. "There have been adjustments. Structurally. New filings. New presentations of ownership." I held his gaze. "Presentations," I repeated. He exhaled softly. "The narrative is different now." Narrative. Another careful word. I appreciated that about him. He was not trying to alarm me. He was not trying to soften it either. Just stating what was. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once more, then stepped back, as if he had already said everything he came to say. As he walked away, I slipped my hand into my clutch, my fingers brushing against the edge of the documents inside. Thick paper. Official seals. Signatures that had been placed there long before anyone in this room decided to rewrite the story. I thought about the first time I had written a check for that company. It had been a number that made most people pause, but I had not hesitated. I had seen something in the idea, in the potential, but more than that, I had believed in the people. Belief is a form of investment that does not show up on balance sheets, but it is often the most expensive one you make. Across the room, Rachel was laughing again, her head tilted back slightly, her hand still resting on Daniel's arm. Someone handed her another glass of champagne. She accepted it without looking. That used to be me, I thought. Not the center of attention, but the person who made sure everything held together behind it. The one who noticed details, who asked the questions no one else thought to ask, who stayed late after everyone left to make sure nothing had been overlooked. It is easy to forget those people when things start working. It is even easier to pretend they were never there. A man in a dark suit approached Rachel and Daniel, shaking Daniel's hand firmly. "Congratulations," he said. "We are excited to continue the partnership." Partnership. That word mattered. I watched the exchange carefully, the way Daniel nodded, the way Rachel smiled, the way the man spoke with confidence, as if the structure he believed in was solid, unchangeable. I wondered how long that confidence would last once the full picture came into view. To the man in the dark suit. "We have everything under control," she was saying. "Daniel has been handling all of it personally." All of it. I let that phrase sit for just a second, then I lifted my chin slightly, feeling the familiar calm settle into place. The same calm I used to rely on in meetings where millions of dollars were being discussed like they were numbers on a page instead of decisions that shaped lives. I had not lost that part of myself. I had simply stopped using it. Until now. I adjusted my grip on my clutch, my fingers steady, my expression unchanged, and for the first time that evening, I stepped fully into the space where I could no longer be ignored. I did not raise my voice when I stepped forward. I did not need to. The space made room for me the moment I stopped standing at the edges. It is a subtle shift, the kind people feel before they understand it. Conversations softened, not because anyone asked them to, but because something in the room had changed direction. Rachel was still speaking when she noticed me. Her sentence trailed off mid-thought, her smile holding in place just a second too long before it faltered. Daniel turned next, following her gaze, and for the first time that evening, his eyes did not pass over me. They stopped. "Evelyn," Rachel said, her tone light, almost careful, like she was trying to decide which version of me she was addressing. "Do you need something?" "Need. To keep something from becoming uncomfortable." "Evelyn," she said, "we are just talking about the company. It is nothing you need to worry about." "Nothing you need to worry about." I nodded once, as if I agreed. "You are right," I said. "It is not something I need to worry about." I saw Daniel relax slightly at that. It was brief, but it was there. That assumption again. That I was stepping back. That I was confirming the version of the story they had already decided was true. I adjusted my grip on my clutch, feeling the edge of the papers inside press lightly against my palm. "But it is something I should probably clarify," I added. The man in the dark suit looked between us, his expression shifting from polite interest to something more attentive. Rachel's smile faded just a little more. "Clarify what?" she asked. I did not answer right away. Instead, I turned slightly, just enough to include the small circle of people who had gathered without meaning to. That is how it happens. No one announces it. People just stop moving. Stop talking. Start listening. I have been hearing a lot tonight, I said, my voice still even, still quiet. About how things were built. About who was there from the beginning. About how everything came together. Daniel straightened, his jaw setting in a way that suggested he was preparing for something he did not fully understand yet. Evelyn, he said, this is not really the time. I lifted my hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to pause him. It worked. He stopped speaking. Not because I forced him to, but because he chose to. That is an important distinction. You are right, I said again. It is a celebration, and I would not want to take away from that. Rachel nodded quickly, almost relieved. Exactly, she said. So maybe we can, but celebrations are built on stories. I continued, my voice threading carefully through hers without raising in volume. And stories should be accurate. The man in the dark suit frowned slightly, his attention fully fixed on me now. I could see the calculation starting behind his eyes, the quiet reassessment of context, of roles, of information he might not have been given. Rachel's fingers tightened around her glass. Evelyn, she said, more firmly this time, I do not think this is necessary. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment, I saw something flicker beneath the surface. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to uncertainty. That was new. It is not necessary, I agreed softly. Unless something important has been left out. Daniel stepped forward half a step, placing himself slightly between Rachel and me. It was a subtle move, protective on the surface, but it also positioned him directly in front of me, as if that would control the direction of the conversation. If you have a concern, he said, choosing his words carefully, we can discuss it another time. Privately. I almost smiled. I appreciate that, I said. But I think everyone here deserves to understand exactly what they are celebrating. A few more people had turned toward us now. Conversations had thinned out across the room, replaced by that quiet, collective attention that settles in before something significant happens. No one spoke. No one interrupted. They were waiting. I reached into my clutch then, slowly, deliberately, not rushing the motion, not making it dramatic, just making it clear. The papers slid easily into my hand, crisp, unbent, exactly as I had placed them there before leaving my house. For a moment, I did not unfold them. I just held them, letting the weight of what they represented exist without explanation. Daniel's eyes dropped briefly to my hand, then back to my face. What is that? He asked. His voice was still controlled, but there was something else there now. Something tighter. Documentation, I said. The kind that tends to matter. Rachel shook her head slightly, a small, dismissive gesture that did not quite match the tension in her shoulders. Evelyn, this is not appropriate, she said. We are not discussing business tonight. Business. Another interesting word. I am not discussing business, I replied. I am correcting a misunderstanding. I unfolded the papers then, the sound quiet but distinct in the stillness that had settled over the room. It is a simple sound, paper opening, but in the right moment, it can carry more weight than any raised voice. I glanced down briefly, not because I needed to read them, but because it gave everyone else a second to feel the pause, to sit in the uncertainty of not knowing what was coming next. Then I looked up again, meeting Daniel's eyes first, then Rachel's, then letting my gaze move just slightly beyond them to include everyone else who had gathered. You said you built this company from the ground up, I said, my tone unchanged, and that everything it is now belongs to you. I let that sit for just a second. Not long. Just enough. That is not entirely accurate. The room did not react all at once. It never does. But I saw it in the small things. The way the man in the dark suit straightened. The way someone near the bar stopped mid-sip. The way Rachel's grip on her glass tightened just enough to catch the light. Daniel held my gaze, and for the first time since I had arrived, there was no assumption left in his expression. Only attention. I lowered my eyes to the papers again, then back up, my voice still calm, still measured, still steady enough that no one could mistake it for anything but certainty. Because the company you are describing, I said, was never yours to begin with. No one spoke after that. Not immediately. The kind of silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition. The slow, uncomfortable realization that something fundamental had just shifted, even if they did not yet understand how far. Daniel blinked once, as if recalibrating, then gave a small, controlled smile that did not reach his eyes. I think there might be some misunderstanding, he said carefully. His voice was still steady, but there was a thinness to it now, like something stretched just a little too tight. I shook my head slightly. No, I said. There is no misunderstanding. I held the papers a little higher, not waving them, not forcing attention, just making them visible. Rachel's gaze dropped to them again, then quickly back to my face, as if looking too long might confirm something she was not ready to accept. Evelyn, she said, her tone softer now, almost cautious, this is not the place for this. Place. Timing. Appropriateness. Those are the tools people use when they want to control when the truth is allowed to exist. I had used them myself, once. You are right, I said quietly. It is not the place they would have chosen. That landed. I saw it in the way Daniel's expression hardened just slightly, in the way the man in the dark suit folded his arms, shifting from guest to observer. But it is the place where the story was told, I continued. So it seems fair that it is also the place where it gets corrected. Rachel took a small step closer, lowering her voice. We can talk about this later, she said. Please. Please. It had been a long time since she had used that word with me. For a second, I almost responded to it the way I used to. I almost stepped back, almost softened. But then I remembered the name tag. Guest. I remembered the conversations I had overheard, the careful rewriting, the quiet removal of everything I had done. And I let that moment pass. Later does not change what has already been said, I replied. Daniel exhaled slowly, then reached out, not touching the papers, but gesturing toward them. If you are referring to early investments, he said, those were resolved years ago. We have documentation for all of that. Resolved. That was an interesting choice of word. I nodded once. Yes, I said. We do have documentation. I emphasized the word just slightly, enough for it to carry. The man in the dark suit leaned forward a fraction, his attention sharpening. He was listening differently now, not as a guest, as someone who understood that something material might be at stake. Daniel, he said quietly, maybe we should take a look. Daniel did not move. His eyes stayed on mine, searching, calculating, trying to find the angle he was missing. This is unnecessary, Rachel said quickly, her voice tightening. Everyone is here to celebrate. We are not turning this into what? I asked gently. She stopped. The question hung there, unanswered, because there was no safe way to define it without acknowledging what was already happening. I lowered my gaze to the papers again and unfolded them fully this time, smoothing them with a small, precise motion. The seal at the top caught the light. Official. Undeniable. These are the original ownership filings, I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. Dated before the first office was leased, before the first employee was hired, before the first product was even finalized. I glanced up briefly, meeting Daniel's eyes. Before you. That landed harder. I saw it in the way his shoulders squared, in the way his jaw tightened just enough to show that the control he had been holding was starting to require effort. That does not prove current ownership, he replied, his tone sharpening slightly. Things change. Structures evolve. I nodded again. They do, I agreed. Which is why there are also amendments. I turned the page, the sound of paper shifting echoing quietly in the stillness around us. Filed 3 years ago, and again 18 months ago, and again 6 months ago. I let each point sit, not rushing through them. Precision matters more than speed in moments like this. Each one reaffirming the same thing. The man in the dark suit stepped closer now, close enough to see the documents clearly. His eyes moved across the page quickly, trained, experienced. I watched his expression change in small increments. Interest, focus, recognition. He looked up at Daniel. These are valid filings, he said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. Rachel's breath caught slightly, almost imperceptible, but I heard it. Daniel did not look away from me. What are you saying? He asked. The question was direct now. No more framing. No more soft language. Just the core of it. I held his gaze, steady, unblinking, and for the first time since I had stepped forward, I allowed a hint of something to surface. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just certainty. I am saying, I replied, that the company you have been presenting as yours, I paused, not for effect, but to make sure every word that followed landed exactly where it needed to, is legally, entirely, and continuously owned by me. The room did not erupt. It did not need to. The impact of a statement like that is not loud. It is immediate. It moves through people in silence, in the quick exchange of glances, in the way posture shifts, in the way assumptions collapse without anyone announcing it. Rachel stared at me, her expression no longer controlled, no longer composed. Just open. Daniel did not move at all. For a second, he looked like he was still processing, still trying to fit the words into the version of reality he had been operating in. The man in the dark suit took a slow step back, his attention now fully recalibrated. He was no longer looking at Daniel. He was looking at me. And around us, the room adjusted, quietly, almost instinctively, as if everyone had just realized they had been facing the wrong direction all night. No. One asked me to repeat it. They did not need to. The words had already settled into the room, quiet but immovable, like something heavy placed at the center of a table that no one could ignore. I lowered the papers slightly, not hiding them, just letting them rest in my hand as if they had always belonged there. As if this moment was simply the natural continuation of something that had been set in motion a long time ago. Daniel was the first to move. Not physically at first, but in the way his expression shifted, the way his focus sharpened from uncertainty into something more deliberate. That is not possible, he said, and this time there was no softness left in his voice. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was firm, controlled, the kind of statement someone makes when they are trying to anchor themselves to what they believe is true. I met his gaze without blinking. It is already documented, I replied. Rachel shook her head quickly, a reflex more than a decision. No, she said, almost under her breath, as if denying it quietly might make it less real. No, that is not how this works. I watched her carefully, noticing the small things. The way her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. The way her shoulders, which had been relaxed all evening, were now slightly raised, like she was bracing for something she could not yet define. It is exactly how it works, I said gently. The man in the dark suit stepped closer again, his attention fully aligned now, no longer divided. Ms. Harper, he said, his tone respectful in a way it had not been before. May I? He gestured toward the papers. I nodded once and extended them toward him. He took them carefully, scanning the pages with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. I did not rush him. I did not fill the silence. I let the room sit with itself, with the shift that had already begun but had not yet fully settled. Around us, people had stopped pretending not to listen. Conversations had faded completely now. The music still played, but it felt distant, irrelevant, like it belonged to another event entirely. These filings are active, the man said after a moment, his voice steady, professional. And they are clear. He looked up at Daniel, then at Rachel, and there was no hesitation in his expression. Majority ownership has not changed. Majority ownership. Words that carry weight even when spoken quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened again, but this time he did not respond immediately. He was thinking now, recalculating, searching for a path that still made sense within the reality he had been operating in. There must be additional agreements, he said finally. Side arrangements. Transfers. Something that is not reflected here. I tilted my head slightly. If there were, I said, they would be reflected. That was the part people often forget. Documentation is not just about what exists. It is about what does not. Rachel took a step forward then, closing the small distance between us, her voice dropping even lower. Evelyn, she said, and this time there was something else in it. Not authority, not dismissal, something closer to urgency. You are making this into something it does not need to be. I held her gaze. It was already made into something, I replied. I am simply correcting the version. Her eyes searched mine, looking for something familiar, something she could still use to guide the conversation back into a place she understood. But that version of me, the one who adjusted, who stepped back, who allowed things to smooth over, was not standing there anymore. You could have said something earlier, she said. Privately. Earlier. I considered that for a moment. Not because I doubted what I was doing, but because I understood exactly what she meant. There had been many earlier moments. Many opportunities to speak, to interrupt, to correct. And each time, I had chosen not to. Not because I could not. Because I wanted to see how far they would go. I did, I said quietly. Just not in a way you chose to hear. That stopped her. Not completely, but enough. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in a controlled motion that suggested he was still trying to maintain the image he had built in front of everyone. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked. His tone was sharper now, more direct, less concerned with appearances. I appreciated that. It made things simpler. "I am not implying anything," I said. "I am stating something." I gestured slightly toward the papers still in the man's hands. "The company you have been operating, expanding, and presenting as your own," I paused just long enough for the weight of that sentence to settle again, "is under my authority." The word authority changed the air. Ownership can sound abstract to people who are not used to dealing with it. Authority is different. It is immediate. It is actionable. It implies decisions, consequences, direction. I saw it register in the way the man in the dark suit adjusted his stance, in the way a few others exchanged quick glances, in the way the entire room seemed to lean in just slightly without realizing it. Daniel's expression hardened, but there was something else beneath it now. Not disbelief. That had passed. This was something closer to recognition. Not acceptance. Not yet. But recognition that the situation was no longer under his control. Rachel's shoulders dropped slightly, not in relief, but in something that looked almost like realization. She looked at me differently now, not as someone who had interrupted the evening, but as someone she had misjudged. That shift was quiet, but it was real. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, and this time the question was not strategic. It was personal. I held her gaze for a moment, then answered simply, "Because you already did." She did not respond. She did not need to. The answer was not something that required agreement. It was just something that existed between us now, as clear and unavoidable as the papers in the man's hands. He returned them to me carefully, almost respectfully. "If you need anything reviewed further," he said, "I would be available." I nodded once. "Thank you." He stepped back, but he did not disengage. No one did. The room had shifted too far for that. I folded the papers again, just as neatly as before, and placed them back into my clutch. The action was small, controlled, final in a way that did not need to be announced. Then I looked at Daniel, then at Rachel, and then briefly at the rest of the room, letting the silence stretch just a second longer. Not to make them uncomfortable, just to let the truth settle into place fully, without interruption. "You can continue your celebration," I said calmly. "Nothing about this evening needs to stop." I let that sit for a moment, then added, just as evenly, "But everything about it has changed." No one moved right away after I said that. The kind of stillness that follows a shift in power does not invite motion. It holds people in place, just long enough for them to understand that whatever comes next will not look like what came before. Daniel was the first to break it, but even that was controlled. He let out a slow breath, then nodded once, as if accepting something without agreeing to it. "If that is true," he said, choosing each word carefully, "then there are processes. Legal processes. This is not something decided in a room like this." I watched him for a moment, noting the way he had shifted from certainty to structure. It was a familiar move. When control slips, people reach for procedure. "You are right," I said. "It is not decided here." That gave him a small foothold. I saw it in the way his shoulders eased just slightly. "Then we can handle this properly," he continued. "Through the appropriate channels." "Appropriate channels." I nodded again. "Of course," I said. "That is exactly how it will be handled." There was a pause, and for a second, it almost felt like the tension might dissolve into something more manageable. Rachel exhaled quietly, her posture softening just a fraction, as if she believed the moment had passed its peak. But then I added, "Starting tomorrow morning." The words were not loud, but they landed with precision. Daniel's expression tightened again. "What does that mean?" he asked. I did not look away. "It means," I said, "that every decision made under the assumption that you were operating independently will be reviewed." I let that sit for a second, then continued, still calm, still measured. "Every contract, every financial movement, every representation made to partners." The man in the dark suit straightened slightly, his attention sharpening even further. This was no longer a social moment for him. It was a professional one. Rachel's hand lowered slowly from where it had been holding her glass, her fingers now resting against her side, as if she had forgotten what to do with them. "Evelyn," she said, her voice quieter now, "you are overcomplicating this." I shook my head gently. "No," I replied. "I am simplifying it." Daniel's jaw tightened again, But this time he did not interrupt. He was listening now, not to respond, but to understand the scope of what I was saying. That was the difference. For a long time, I continued. I allowed the structure to operate without interference. That was intentional. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes at that. Not relief. Recognition. But that does not mean it was unobserved. The room was completely silent now. Even the background music seemed distant, like it was happening behind a closed door. You have been very effective, I said, and this time there was a hint of something else in my tone. Not praise. Not criticism. Just acknowledgment. Growth has been strong. Expansion has been aggressive. The narrative has been consistent. That word again. Narrative. It hung in the air between us. Daniel held my gaze, and for the first time, there was no attempt to redirect, no attempt to soften. Just direct attention. And now, he asked. Simple. Direct. I appreciated that. Now, I said, the narrative aligns with the structure. Rachel shook her head slightly, as if trying to clear it. This does not make sense, she said. If you had this level of control, why would you stay silent? It was a fair question. On the surface, I looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, and I could see the confusion there, the attempt to reconcile the version of me she had constructed with the reality standing in front of her. Because silence is informative, I said quietly. It shows you who people become when they think no one is watching. That landed differently. Not as a threat, not as an accusation, just as a fact. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. And what exactly did you see, he asked. I did not answer right away. I let the question sit, not because I did not have an answer, but because the answer was not something that needed to be delivered quickly. I saw efficiency, I said finally. I saw ambition. I saw the ability to build momentum. I paused, then added, and I saw where the lines began to blur. The man in the dark suit shifted his weight again, his expression now fully aligned with the seriousness of the situation. He was no longer just observing. He was assessing. Rachel's shoulders dropped slightly, not in defeat, but in something closer to realization. She looked at Daniel, then back at me, as if seeing both of us for the first time in a different light. What happens now? She asked. The question was not strategic this time. It was genuine. I answered just as simply. Now, I said, we move forward with clarity. Daniel exhaled slowly, then nodded once, a small, controlled motion that suggested he was beginning to accept the new framework, even if he had not yet decided how to respond within it. And if there are disagreements? He asked. I held his gaze. Then they will be addressed, I said. Properly. The word carried weight now, because it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the structure he had overlooked. I adjusted my clutch slightly, feeling the papers inside settle back into place, no longer needed to be seen to be understood. The room had already absorbed what they represented. Around us, people remained still, not because they were instructed to, but because they understood that this was not something to interrupt. This was not a moment for commentary. It was a moment for recognition. I looked at Rachel one more time, then at Daniel, and then briefly at the rest of the room. You should continue, I said again, my tone unchanged. This is still your evening. I paused, just long enough for that to settle, then added, but starting tomorrow, it will also be mine. The words did not need emphasis. They carried their own weight. And this time, no one mistook where they were coming from. The room did not return to normal after that. It only pretended to. Conversations restarted in fragments, voices lower than before, laughter delayed and slightly offbeat, like everyone was trying to follow a script they no longer trusted. I stepped back, not retreating, just giving the space room to rearrange itself around the new reality. That is another thing people misunderstand about power. It does not require you to stay at the center. Once it is recognized, it follows you. I moved toward the edge of the room again, but this time, no one looked past me. They looked at me directly, some with curiosity, some with caution, some with the quiet calculation of people reassessing their position in a structure they had just realized was different than they thought. I picked up a fresh glass of water from a passing tray, not because I needed it, but because it gave my hands something to do while the room adjusted. The condensation was cool against my fingers again, grounding, familiar. Across the room, Daniel was already speaking with the man in the dark suit, their heads slightly inclined toward each other, voices low, focused. Rachel stood a few feet away, no longer at the center, her posture more still than before, as if she was trying to hold on to something that had already shifted beyond her reach. I watched them for a moment, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, just with clarity. This was the part most people never see. Not the moment of revelation, but what comes immediately after. The quiet reordering. The invisible lines being redrawn. Thomas appeared at my side again, his presence steady, unintrusive. "You timed that well," he said softly. I allowed a small breath of something that could almost be called a smile. "Timing is rarely accidental," I replied. He nodded, his gaze moving briefly across the room. "There are going to be questions," he said. "There usually are," I answered. He hesitated for a second, then added, "Some of them may not be asked directly." I glanced at him. "They do not need to be," I said. "The answers will still be heard." He gave a small nod, understanding, then stepped away again, leaving me alone with the room that no longer felt quite the same. A woman I did not recognize approached me next, her expression polite, but more deliberate than before. "Miss Harper," she said, extending her hand slightly. "I do not believe we have met. I am Claire." I shook her hand lightly. "Evelyn," I said. She smiled, but there was a question behind it now, something measured. "I have heard a lot about the company tonight," she said carefully. "It seems like an exciting space." I met her gaze. "It is," I replied. She hesitated, then added, "And your role?" There it was. Direct, but still cautious. I did not elaborate. I did not need to. "It is defined," I said simply. She held my gaze for a second longer, then nodded, as if that was enough. Because it was. She stepped back with a polite smile, but I could see the shift in her posture as she moved away. Information travels quickly in rooms like this, not through announcements, but through tone, through presence, through what is not said as much as what is. Across the room, Daniel looked up briefly, his eyes finding mine again. This time, he did not look away immediately. He held the contact for a second, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not agreement. Not approval. Recognition. I returned it just as slightly. That was all that was required. Rachel approached me a few minutes later. Slower this time. No audience gathered around her. No central position holding her in place. Just her, moving through the space like someone trying to understand where it had shifted. "Evelyn," she said, stopping a few feet away. I turned toward her. "Rachel." She looked at me for a moment, searching for something familiar again, something she could still reach. "You could have told me," she said. Not accusing, not defensive, just uncertain. I considered her words, not because I needed to defend my choice, but because I understood the weight behind them. "I did," I said quietly. "Just not in a way you chose to listen to." She looked down briefly, then back up, her expression softer now, but also more exposed. "This changes things," she said. I nodded once. "Yes," I replied. She hesitated, then asked, "For us?" The question lingered there, more fragile than anything she had said before. I held her gaze, steady, calm. "That depends," I said. She waited, but I did not elaborate. Some answers are not given all at once. Some are revealed over time, through choices, through actions, through what people do when they realize the ground beneath them is no longer what they thought it was. Daniel joined us a moment later, his presence more measured now, less performative, more precise. "We should talk tomorrow," he said, his tone even. I nodded. "We will," I replied. He looked at me for a second, then added, "There are details that need to be clarified." I met his gaze. "There are," I agreed. Another pause. Not tense, not hostile, just different. He nodded once, then stepped back, his attention already shifting toward what came next, toward the structure he would now have to navigate differently. I watched him go, then turned slightly, letting my gaze move across the room one more time. The lighting had not changed. The music had not changed. The decorations were still exactly where they had been. But the room itself felt entirely different. Not because anything visible had shifted, but because everyone in it now understood something they had not before. I picked up my clutch, feeling the familiar weight of the papers inside, no longer hidden, no longer overlooked, simply present. Then I took a slow breath, steady, controlled, and stepped forward, not toward the center this time, but toward the exit, moving through the space with the same calm I had carried all evening, knowing that behind me, the story they had told would not disappear, but it would no longer stand on its own. I did not look back immediately when I stepped outside. The doors closed behind me with a soft, controlled sound, muting the music, the voices, the carefully arranged celebration that no longer belonged to the version of the evening they had planned. The air outside was cooler, quieter, the kind of quiet that does not demand anything from you. I paused at the top of the steps, my hand resting lightly on the railing, not because I needed the support, but because it gave me a moment to feel the shift settle fully. Inside, everything had changed. Outside, everything felt exactly the same. That contrast has always been important. It reminds you that power is not about noise. It is about position. I walked slowly across the parking lot, the sound of my heels steady against the pavement, each step measured, unhurried. I had parked a little farther than necessary, a habit from years of preferring space over convenience. When I reached the car, I did not get in right away. I placed my clutch on the hood, opened it, and looked at the documents one more time. Not to confirm them. I already knew what they said, but to acknowledge them. They had been quiet for a long time. Tonight, they had finally been heard. I closed the clutch again and sat in the driver's seat, resting my hands lightly on the steering wheel without starting the engine. The silence inside the car was different from the silence outside. It was contained, focused, the kind of silence where decisions become clear. I did not rush to leave. There was no need. Whatever needed to unfold inside that room would do so without me now. I had already changed the direction of it. My phone buzzed softly in my bag. Once. Then again. I did not reach for it immediately. I knew who it would be. Not because I had checked, but because moments like this always follow the same pattern. First comes the realization. Then comes the attempt to regain control. I let it buzz a third time before opening my bag and taking it out. Rachel. Of course. I watched the screen for a second as it lit up again, then answered. Evelyn, she said quickly, her voice lower than it had been inside, but carrying something sharper now, something less composed. Where did you go? I leaned back slightly in the seat. Outside, I said. There was a pause. Not long. Just enough for her to recalibrate. You cannot just leave like that, she said. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was amusing, but because it was predictable. I did not just leave, I replied. I finished what I came to do. She exhaled, the sound faint but present. People are asking questions, she said. They are confused. I looked out through the windshield. The building still visible in front of me. Lights warm, unchanged. They will understand, I said. Eventually. Another pause. This one longer. You embarrassed him, she said finally. Not loudly. Not accusing. Just stating what she believed had happened. I considered that for a moment. No, I said. I corrected him. Silence. Then, softer, there was a way to do this differently. I turned my head slightly, looking back toward the entrance, imagining the room as it was now. The conversations, the recalculations, the quiet adjustments. There were many ways, I said. This was the one that matched what was already happening. She did not respond right away. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Not as sharp, not as certain. What happens now? She asked. The same question she had asked inside. But this time, it carried more weight. I rested my hand on the steering wheel again, my fingers still. Now, I said, things move into alignment. She was quiet for a few seconds, then said, he is trying to understand what this means. I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it. He will, I replied. He is capable. That was true. This was not about his ability. It never had been. And you? She asked. What do you want? I looked down briefly at my hands, then back up at the building. The question was direct. Simple. But the answer was not something that fit into a single sentence. I want the structure to reflect reality, I said finally. She let that sit, then asked, and us? I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of exhaustion, but out of clarity. That word again. Us. It had been used so easily before. So casually. Now it required definition. That depends on what you choose to see, I said. She inhaled slowly, then exhaled, the sound steadier now. I need to go back in, she said. They are waiting. Waiting. Yes. I imagined the room again. The shift that had not yet fully settled. The questions that would continue to move quietly from one person to another. Then go, I said. There was a small pause. Then, we will talk tomorrow. Yes, I replied. We will. She ended the call without another word. I set the phone down beside me and sat there for a moment longer, letting the quiet return. No more interruptions. No more voices trying to shape the moment. Just stillness. I reached for the ignition, then stopped, my hand hovering just above it. There was no urgency. There never had been. That was the part they had misunderstood from the beginning. I was not reacting. I was timing. I started the car, the engine turning over smoothly, and pulled out of the parking space with the same steady motion I had carried all evening. As I drove away, the building grew smaller in the rearview mirror, the lights fading slightly with distance. But the shift I had set in motion did not fade. It would follow them into tomorrow, into every conversation, every decision, every document. They would now have to look at differently. And for the first time in a long time, I did not feel like I had been left out of the story. I had simply been waiting for the right moment to step back into it. The drive home was quiet, but not empty. There is a difference between silence and absence. Silence carries thought. It carries reflection. Absence carries nothing. As I turned onto the main road, the streetlights stretched ahead in even intervals, each one passing in a steady rhythm that matched the pace of my breathing. I did not replay the evening the way most people would. I did not focus on the moment itself, the looks, the silence, the shift in the room. I focused on what it meant moving forward. That has always been my habit. Moments are temporary. Structure is not. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the night had settled fully around the neighborhood. The house looked exactly as I had left it. Still, ordered, predictable. I stepped inside, placing my keys on the small table by the door, the soft click echoing faintly in the quiet space. I did not turn on all the lights. Just the one in the kitchen. Enough to see. Enough to move. I set my clutch down on the counter and opened it again, taking the documents out and placing them flat on the surface. The paper caught the light the same way it had earlier, but here, it felt different. Not because the content had changed, but because the context had. Tonight, those pages had moved from background to center. That shift cannot be undone. My phone buzzed again, this time not with urgency, but with persistence. A message, then another. I picked it up and glanced at the screen. Daniel. I did not open it right away. I did not need to read it to know what it would say. Clarifications. Questions. An attempt to reframe the conversation into something manageable. That is what people do when they realize they have been operating without full visibility. They try to restore it. I set the phone back down without responding and walked to the sink, filling a glass with water. The sound was steady, controlled. I took a small sip, then set the glass down beside the papers. Tomorrow would not be about emotion. It would not be about perception. It would be about alignment. I pulled out a chair and sat down, not out of fatigue, but out of intention. Sitting slows you down. It forces you to think in sequence instead of reaction. I reached for my phone again, this time opening the messages. Daniel's name sat at the top. 3 messages. I opened the first. We need to talk first thing in the morning. Direct. Expected. The second. There are details here that do not match what we have been operating under. That was more interesting. Not denial. Discrepancy. The third. I want to understand exactly what this means before anything escalates. I read that one twice. Not because it was complex, but because of what it revealed. He was not panicking. He was adjusting. That made him more capable than most. I set the phone down again and leaned back slightly in the chair, letting the weight of the evening settle into something clearer. This was not about confrontation anymore. That part was over. This was about what comes after. I stood up again and walked down the hallway to my study, a room I had not used in a while, but had never closed. The desk was exactly as I had left it. Files organized. Drawers aligned. I sat down and opened the top drawer, pulling out a folder I had not touched in months. Inside were copies, backup records, correspondence. Not because I expected to need them, but because I understood the value of preparedness. I placed the folder on the desk and opened it, scanning the contents briefly. Everything was in place, exactly where it should be. That was the advantage of structure. It does not change when people do. My phone buzzed again. This time a call. Daniel. I looked at the screen for a second, then answered. Evelyn, he said, his voice quieter than before, but more focused. I need clarity. I leaned back slightly in the chair. You have documentation, I said. Start there. There was a brief pause. The documentation does not reflect the operational reality we have been working with, he replied. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. Then the operational reality needs to be adjusted. I said. Silence. Then, you are saying that every decision we have made, I am saying, I interrupted gently, that every decision was made within a structure you did not fully acknowledge. He exhaled slowly. Not frustration. Processing. Why now, he asked. The question was simple. I appreciated that. Because now it matters, I replied. Another pause. Longer this time. It has always mattered, he said. Not to you, I answered. The line went quiet. Not disconnected. Just still. Then, more carefully, what do you want to happen next? I did not answer immediately. Not because I did not know, but because the answer needed to be heard clearly. Tomorrow, I said, we meet with full documentation. Legal present. Financial records open. No assumptions. I let that settle, then added, from there, we move forward based on what is actually in place. He was quiet again, then said, and if that changes things significantly? I allowed a small pause of my own. It already has, I said. No argument followed. No attempt to push back. Just a quiet understanding that the conversation had moved beyond negotiation into recognition. 10 o'clock, he said finally. At the office. I nodded once. 10 o'clock, I repeated. The call ended without anything further. I set the phone down on the desk and looked at the folder in front of me, then at the room around me, the quiet, the order, the stillness that had always been there, waiting. This was not the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of something that had never actually stopped. I closed the folder, placed it neatly back on the desk, and stood up, turning off the light as I left the room. Tomorrow would not be loud. It would not need to be. It would be precise. And for the first time in a long time, everything would be exactly where it was supposed to be. The next morning did not arrive with urgency. It arrived with clarity. I woke before the alarm, not because I was restless, but because my mind had already settled into the shape of what needed to be done. There is a difference between anxiety and readiness. One pulls you in every direction. The other moves you forward in a straight line. I chose the latter a long time ago. The house was quiet as I moved through it. The same quiet from the night before, unchanged, steady. I dressed simply, deliberately, in a way that did not draw attention but did not diminish presence. A dark blazer, a clean line, nothing unnecessary. I did not rush breakfast. I did not check my phone immediately. I allowed the morning to unfold at its own pace, because control is not about speed. It is about sequence. When I finally picked up my phone, there were no new messages. That told me everything I needed to know. Daniel had stopped trying to resolve this through words. He was waiting for the meeting. Good. That meant he understood where the real conversation would happen. The drive to the office was different from the night before. The same roads, the same turns, but the purpose had shifted. Last night had been revelation. Today would be confirmation. When I arrived, the building looked exactly as it always had. Glass, steel, clean lines. A structure designed to reflect stability. It had always done that well. What it had not reflected, until now, was the full truth behind it. I parked, stepped out, and walked toward the entrance without hesitation. Inside, the lobby was already active, employees moving with quiet efficiency, conversations low, focused. Some of them glanced at me as I passed, not with recognition at first, but with something else. Awareness. It travels quickly, even without being spoken. By the time I reached the elevator, I could feel it. Not attention. Adjustment. The doors opened, and I stepped in alone. The ride up was short, but long enough to center everything. I did not think about what I would say. I did not rehearse. The facts were already in place. All that remained was to let them stand. The conference room was prepared when I arrived. Not by me. By them. That told me even more. Daniel was already there, seated at the far end of the table, a folder open in front of him, his posture straight, composed. Rachel sat to his right, quieter than I had ever seen her, her hands folded in front of her. Two other individuals were present. Legal. Financial. Exactly as expected. I stepped into the room without pausing and took a seat opposite Daniel, placing my own folder on the table, but not opening it yet. No one spoke immediately. That was appropriate. This was not a conversation that began with small talk. Daniel was the first to break the silence. Thank you for coming, he said. His tone was controlled, professional. No trace of last night's uncertainty. He had adjusted. I nodded once. Of course. He glanced briefly at the others, then back at me. We reviewed the filings you presented. he said. They are valid. No hesitation. No attempt to dispute the foundation. That was important. However, he continued, there are operational elements that have developed over time which are not fully reflected in those documents. I opened my folder then, slowly, deliberately, and placed a set of additional papers on the table. They are, I said. The legal representative leaned forward slightly, scanning the pages I had just placed down. His expression remained neutral, but his attention sharpened. These include the amendments you referenced, he said after a moment. I nodded. All of them. Daniel watched carefully, his eyes moving between the documents and my face, recalculating again, but this time within a framework he could no longer redefine. Then we need to clarify roles, he said. Not ownership. Roles. I met his gaze. Agreed. Rachel looked up at that, her expression shifting slightly, as if that word offered something she could hold on to. What does that look like? She asked quietly. I considered her question, not because I needed to construct an answer, but because I wanted it to be precise. It looks like alignment, I said. Structure and operation reflecting the same reality. The financial advisor spoke next, his voice measured. That would require adjustments to authority, reporting, and decision-making processes. I nodded. Yes. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting on the table now, no longer gripping the edge. And what is your expectation in that structure? He asked. Direct. Focused. I appreciated that. I held his gaze. Clarity, I said. Visibility. And final authority where it is already established. No raised voice. No emphasis. Just fact. The room absorbed it without resistance this time. There was no surprise left to react to. Only reality to process. Rachel looked between us, then down at the table, her fingers tracing a small, unconscious line along the surface. This changes how everything has been presented, she said softly. I did not respond immediately. Then, yes, I said. Daniel nodded once, slow, deliberate. Then we adjust, he said. Not agreement. Not surrender. Adjustment. That was enough. The legal representative began outlining the next steps, timelines, documentation updates, communication strategies. The language was structured, precise, exactly what it needed to be. I listened, not interrupting, not redirecting. There was no need. The direction had already been set. When he finished, Daniel looked at me again. We will need to communicate this carefully, he said. I nodded. You will. A small pause. Then, and you, he asked. I closed my folder, placing my hand lightly on top of it. I already have, I said. The room was quiet again, but this time it was not uncertain. It was settled. Not everything had been resolved. Not every detail had been finalized. But the structure was no longer hidden. The narrative no longer stood alone. And for the first time, since I had walked into that engagement party, everything was exactly where it needed to be. The meeting did not end with a handshake. It ended with understanding. That is more durable. As the legal representative gathered his notes and the financial advisor closed his laptop, the room did not feel tense anymore. It felt defined. There is a difference. Tension looks for release. Definition creates direction. I remained seated for a moment after the others began to stand, my hands resting lightly on the folder in front of me, not because I needed more time, but because I understood the value of letting a moment settle fully before moving on. Daniel stood across from me, his posture still composed, but no longer guarded in the same way. He had adjusted to the new structure, not emotionally, but functionally. That mattered more. Rachel rose more slowly, her movements quieter, as if she was still recalibrating where she stood in all of this. The others excused themselves, leaving the three of us in the room without commentary, without witnesses, just the space and the reality that now filled it. Daniel was the first to speak. We will need to move quickly, he said. Not as a challenge. As a statement. I nodded once. You will, I replied. He held my gaze for a second, then added, there are people who rely on this structure. I considered that, not because I disagreed, but because I understood exactly what he was referring to. Then it is good that the structure is now accurate, I said. He accepted that without argument. That was another shift. Rachel stepped slightly closer, her expression no longer uncertain, but not fully steady either. I did not know, she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Not as an excuse. As an admission. I looked at her for a moment, seeing the difference between the woman from last night and the one standing here now. It was not dramatic. It was subtle, but it was real. You did not ask, I replied. She did not respond immediately. Her eyes lowered briefly, then returned to mine. I thought I understood everything, she said. I nodded once. That is usually when people stop looking. Silence followed that. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Daniel glanced between us, then back at me. There will be adjustments, he said. Not just operational. Cultural. I appreciated that word. Cultural. It meant he understood this was not just about documents. It was about perception. Yes, I said. There will. He took a small breath, then added, I built a team that believes in a certain version of how things work. I met his gaze. Then they will need to understand the full version, I said. No edge. No emphasis. Just clarity. Rachel looked around the room, as if seeing it differently now, not as a place where she had stood at the center, but as a place that had always been structured in a way she had not fully seen. Will they stay? She asked. The question was not directed at either of us specifically. It was broader than that. I answered simply. The ones who understand well. She nodded slowly, absorbing that, then looked back at me. And the rest? I did not answer immediately. Not because I did not know, but because some outcomes are not dictated. They unfold. We will see, I said. Daniel stepped back slightly, his attention shifting toward the door, toward what came next, toward the continuation of the day that would now look different than it had when it began. We should begin the internal review immediately, he said. Agreed, I replied. He gave a small nod, then turned to leave, stopping briefly at the door. 10 o'clock was the right call, he said without looking back. It usually is, I answered. He left without another word. Rachel remained for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the back of the chair she had been sitting in. I did not mean for it to happen like that, she said. I looked at her, steady calm. It already had, I replied. She absorbed that, her shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in acceptance. I need time to understand this, she said. Take it, I answered. She nodded once, then turned and walked out of the room, her steps slower than before, more deliberate, as if she was paying attention to where she was placing them. I remained where I was for a moment longer, letting the room settle into its new shape without the presence of others. The table, the chairs, the light coming through the windows. None of it had changed, but the meaning of it had. I stood, gathering my folder, and walked toward the door, not rushing, not pausing, just moving forward in the same steady way I had carried all morning. The hallway outside was active again, voices, movement, the rhythm of a workday continuing. But as I stepped into it, I could feel the difference. It was subtle, but it was there. People looked up, not out of curiosity, but out of awareness. Not everyone knew the details. They did not need to. They understood enough. Information moves in layers. I walked past them without slowing, without acknowledging the shift directly, because acknowledgment was not required. Presence was enough. As I reached the elevator, the doors opened almost immediately, and I stepped inside, alone again, the quiet returning, contained, focused. I pressed the button for the ground floor and stood still as the doors closed. The motion smooth, uninterrupted. There was no sense of conclusion. No finality. Just continuation. The kind that does not need to announce itself. When the doors opened again, I stepped out into the lobby, the same space I had walked through earlier, but now aligned with what it had always been connected to. I did not stop. I did not look back. There was nothing left to reveal. Only what remained to be carried forward. By the time I stepped outside the building, the day had fully settled into itself. The sun was higher now, the light sharper than it had been in the morning, reflecting off the glass in a way that made everything look clean, almost too precise. I paused for a moment at the base of the steps, not because I needed to, but because I recognized the moment for what it was. Not an ending, not a victory, just alignment. That is the part people misunderstand. They think moments like this are about winning, about proving something, about standing above others. They are not. They are about restoring what was always there, just hidden beneath assumptions and silence. I walked toward my car at the same steady pace I had carried since the night before, the rhythm unchanged, the movement deliberate. Nothing in my posture needed to announce anything. The shift had already happened. It did not need reinforcement. As I reached the car, I caught my reflection briefly in the window. The same navy tones. The same composed expression. No visible difference from the woman who had walked into that engagement party the night before, and yet everything was different. Not externally, internally, structurally. That is where change matters. I opened the door and sat inside, placing my folder on the passenger seat beside me, not opening it, not reviewing it again. There was nothing left to confirm. I started the engine, but did not pull away immediately. The quiet inside the car returned, familiar, contained. My phone rested in the cup holder, still, for the first time since the night before. No messages, no calls. That, more than anything, told me the adjustment was already underway. When people understand where authority truly sits, they do not rush to speak. They wait. They observe. They reposition. I rested my hands lightly on the steering wheel, looking forward through the windshield, not focusing on anything in particular, just allowing the stillness to settle. Rachel would take time. That was clear. Her understanding had not been built on structure. It had been built on proximity, on assumption, on what she believed she saw. That kind of understanding does not shift in a single conversation. It changes slowly, through repeated recognition. Daniel would move faster. He already had. He would analyze, restructure, communicate, adjust. That was his strength. And now, it would be directed within a framework that actually existed. That was the difference. I pulled out of the parking space and merged into the flow of traffic, the movement smooth, uninterrupted. The city moved the same way it always did. People crossing streets, cars stopping at lights, conversations happening inside buildings I passed without noticing. Nothing had changed for them. It did not need to. Not every shift is visible. Some of the most significant ones happen quietly, beneath the surface, altering direction without altering appearance. I drove without rushing, taking the familiar route home, not because it was the fastest, but because it was consistent. Consistency matters when everything else has just been redefined. It gives you something stable to move within. When I reached my neighborhood, the quiet returned again, softer this time, more settled. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, the sudden silence filling the space around me. For a moment, I remained there, hands still resting on the wheel, the same position I had held the night before, but with a different weight behind it. Not anticipation, completion, not of the entire process, but of the part that required presence. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, unlocking the door with the same ease as always. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it. The same arrangement, the same light filtering through the windows, the same stillness. I placed my folder on the table, not opening it, not organizing it further. It did not need attention. It needed time to integrate into everything it would now influence. I moved into the kitchen, pouring a glass of water, the simple action grounding, familiar. I took a sip, then set the glass down, resting my hands lightly against the counter. There was no rush to do anything else. No immediate task that demanded attention. That was another thing people misunderstand. They expect the moment after to be filled with action, with decisions, with visible change. But the most important part comes before all of that. It is the stillness where everything settles into its correct place. I walked to the window and looked outside. The street quiet, unchanged, the same as it had been the day before and the day before that. Life does not pause for alignment. It continues. And now, so would I? Not differently in appearance. Not dramatically. Just accurately. That is all it had ever required. I turned away from the window and moved through the house with the same calm, steady pace, not thinking about what had happened, not replaying it, not questioning it. It was done. Not finished, but established. And that is enough. Because once something is established, it does not need to be repeated. It simply needs to be maintained. I paused briefly in the hallway, then continued forward, the rhythm of my steps even, unhurried, the same as they had always been, knowing that everything ahead would now unfold within a structure that no longer needed to be explained. It only needed to exist.